There's a stretch of water so narrow you could cross it in a commercial flight in under 4 minutes. 33 kilometers at its tightest point, blue on every map. Unremarkable to most people who've never had reason to think about it. And yet, for decades, roughly 1/5 of every barrel of oil keeping this planet's economies alive has passed through it. Factories in South Korea, power plants in Japan, refineries in India. The fuel in the aircraft you last flew on, traced back far enough, a staggering amount of it came through that single slender corridor, the Strait of Hormuz. And in March of 2026, it closed. Not metaphorically, not partially. Commercial shipping through one of the most trafficked waterways on Earth effectively collapsed. The International Maritime Organization convened an emergency session in London, a rare, urgent gathering that signals the kind of disruption that keeps energy ministers up at night. Major shipping lines, including Maersk and MSC, made the call that most industry observers had long feared. They rerouted, entirely, away from the Gulf, down around the Horn of Africa, adding weeks, sometimes nearly a month, to every single journey. Think about what that means. Every delay compounds. Every extra week at sea is fuel burned, wages paid, perishable cargo at risk, supply chains stretched to breaking. And that was just the beginning. Within a single weekend, from Friday to Monday, benchmark freight rates for very large crude carriers surged by 94%. Not over a quarter, not over a month, over a weekend. By Thursday, Brent crude was trading at $116 per barrel. That represents a 60% price jump, the kind of move that historically precedes recessions, triggers emergency government interventions, and wipes billions off corporate balance sheets in a single session. But reduce this to an oil story and you miss half of the picture. Because 44% of the world's sulfur exports pass through Hormuz. Sulfur isn't a household name, but it is a foundational ingredient in industrial manufacturing. Beyond that, 31% of global urea fertilizer trade moves through this same passage. Urea is what feeds crops. Crops feed people. The moment that corridor closes, the disruption doesn't stay in the energy sector. It migrates into food prices, into production costs, into the invisible inflation that eventually lands on supermarket shelves months later. And by the time most people notice it, nobody's connecting it back to a narrow strip of water in the Middle East. This is what a single choke point can do. One narrow strip of contested water, and the reverberations reach every continent on Earth. Now here is where the story takes a turn that rewards attention. Because not everyone was caught off guard. Saudi Arabia saw something like this coming, and not in 2026, not even in 2016. Back in the 1980s, during the brutal, grinding years of the Iran-Iraq War, Saudi engineers and strategists made a decision that at the time must have seemed cautious to the point of paranoia. They built a pipeline, 1,200 kilometers of it, stretching from the kingdom's massive eastern oil fields, cutting across the Arabian Peninsula, terminating at the Red Sea port of Yanbu, completely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. For decades, that pipeline was infrastructure nobody talked about: backup capacity, insurance, the kind of project that sits quietly on balance sheets while executives focus on the main event. March 2026 was its moment. Saudi crude loadings at Yanbu surged to a record 3.8 million barrels per day. To put that in context, in January of the same year, they were shipping 1.3 million from that port. February, 1.4 million. Then the strait closed, and within weeks they more than doubled their throughput. Around 70 tankers were scheduled to load at Yanbu in March alone, the majority charting course for Asia. China, which depends on Gulf crude to fuel the world's second-largest economy, was absorbing roughly 2.2 million barrels a day through this route alone. The pipeline has a theoretical maximum capacity of 7 million barrels daily, with around 5 million available for export. To push closer to that ceiling, Saudi operators deployed drag-reducing agents, which sounds like something from a motorsport engineer's toolkit, but is actually a specialized chemical injected into the flow that reduces friction inside the pipe and can boost throughput by more than 30%. No new infrastructure, no geopolitical negotiation, just decades of quiet planning paying off exactly when it needed to. Saudi Arabia wasn't alone in having done its homework. The UAE built its own bypass years ago, the Habshan Fujairah pipeline. Approximately 400 kilometers of steel running from Abu Dhabi's inland oil fields directly to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. That port sits entirely outside the strait. No Hormuz, no Chokepoint, just open ocean. Before the crisis, this pipeline carried roughly 1.1 million barrels a day, a supplement, a contingency. In March 2026, it became the UAE's lifeline, running at its absolute maximum, approximately 1.8 million barrels per day. ADNOC, the UAE's national oil company, confirmed they were actively managing operations, squeezing every possible barrel through that corridor to keep their export commitments alive. Fujairah itself transformed almost overnight into one of the most strategically critical ports on the planet. It holds over 70 million barrels of storage capacity across gasoline, diesel, and marine fuel. Tankers lined up daily, loading crude bound predominantly for Asian buyers. A port that most people outside the shipping industry couldn't locate on a map, suddenly sitting at the absolute center of global energy logistics. And then there is Iran, the country at the center of all of this. Here is the uncomfortable arithmetic. Around 90% of Iran's crude exports pass through Karg Island and then out through the Strait of Hormuz, the very waterway they effectively shut down, which would suggest they've trapped themselves, that they've blocked their own exit. Except that's not quite what the data shows. Multiple vessel tracking services, including Capella satellite data, indicate that Iranian exports have not stopped. Approximately 1.4 million barrels a day were still loading at Karg in early March. In roughly 12 days, an estimated 11.7 million barrels passed through the strait, predominantly on Iranian vessels, but also on Indian and Chinese ships. The closure, it appears, applies selectively. The United States is aware of this. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent acknowledged as much publicly that Washington is tolerating Iranian oil sales to prevent an even more catastrophic price spike in global markets. It is a cold-blooded calculation. Let Iran sell oil quietly, keep supply from collapsing entirely, manage the crisis without triggering the full economic earthquake of a complete Iranian export cutoff. The strait is closed, unless your name is Iran. Into this already extraordinary situation, a proposal has entered serious conversation that would have sounded completely absurd 18 months ago. Cut a canal through Oman's Musandam Peninsula, carve a passage from the Persian Gulf directly to the Gulf of Oman, eliminating the need for any vessel to ever transit Hormuz again. The estimated cost? $100 billion. On a flat map, the idea has a compelling simplicity to it. In certain sections of Musandam, only a few dozen kilometers of land separate the two bodies of water. Draw a line through it, add water, and the choke point dissolves. Simple enough, right? The reality is considerably more brutal. The Musandam Peninsula is not desert, it is the Hajar Mountains, limestone peaks climbing above 2,000 meters. This is not dredging sand from a shallow seabed. This is blasting and excavating through one of the most rugged geological formations in the Arabian Peninsula, then engineering a channel deep and wide enough to accommodate very large crude carriers, vessels that rival the length of skyscrapers laid on their sides. The engineering alone is staggering. And even setting aside the construction challenge, the strategic question lingers. Does building an artificial canal actually eliminate the vulnerability, or does it simply create a new one with a $100 billion price tag attached? A natural choke point is difficult to permanently destroy. A man-made canal with control infrastructure, locks, maintenance requirements is a different kind of target entirely. The bottleneck moves, it does not disappear. While the geopolitical arguments play out in conference rooms and summits, something else entirely is unfolding on the water itself, and most people have no idea it's happening. Insurance underwriters have repriced the Gulf in ways that were unimaginable a year ago. Moving a tanker through the region currently requires war risk coverage, costing around 5% of the vessel's total value for a single voyage. On a $100 million ship, that is $5 million just to make one trip. Before the crisis, that same coverage cost roughly 0.25%, a 20-fold increase. And these policies now renew every 7 days. Shipping companies are not buying peace of mind. They are buying 1 week at a time. Meanwhile, on the water's surface and in the satellite data above it, an invisible war persists. Approximately 10% of vessels currently operating in the Gulf, an estimated 250 ships, are displaying what analysts call tracking anomalies. Some have disabled their transponders entirely. Others are broadcasting false position data, spoofing their locations to disguise their actual routes. Between 75 and 100 vessels are believed to belong to Iran's shadow fleet. Old ships, false identities, operating in the deep ocean, conducting ship-to-ship cargo transfers far from any monitoring infrastructure, then vanishing from global tracking systems for months at a time. It is oil smuggling at a scale that makes previous sanctions evasion look modest. Step back, and the strategic picture that emerges is remarkable. 20 million barrels a day once moved through Hormuz. Today, effective Middle Eastern exports are running at roughly 1/3 of normal levels. This is not temporary noise. It is beginning to look like a structural realignment of how global energy moves, where it comes from, and who controls the routes it travels. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, through decades of quiet infrastructure investment, have preserved meaningful export capacity. The canal proposal, however complicated, is attracting serious discussion in circles that rarely entertain $100 billion hypotheticals. And Oman, the quiet, neutral sultanate that shares control of the strait and whose territory any canal would require, suddenly finds itself holding a form of geographic leverage it has never possessed before. But the deepest irony, the one that history will likely spend considerable time with, it belongs to Iran. For decades, the threat to close the Strait of Hormuz was Tehran's most powerful card. It was the thing that kept Washington calculating, kept Gulf states nervous, kept energy markets perpetually pricing in a risk premium that never fully went away. The geography gave Iran leverage that no amount of sanctions could fully neutralize. And now, they have played that card, fully, publicly, irreversibly. And then, just as the world was beginning to reroute itself permanently, something shifted. As of April 9, 2026, Iran has signaled a tentative reopening of the strait. A fragile 2-week ceasefire is now in place. The immediate situation has, for now, been paused. But paused is not the same as resolved. And even as that pause took hold, the reality on the water told a different story. As of April 15, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz remains under a U.S.-enforced blockade. Early reports indicate that on the very first day of enforcement, no commercial ships were allowed to pass. Vessels attempting transit were turned back, a clear signal that control over the corridor is still being actively asserted. At the same time, Donald Trump has offered a sharply different narrative. In public statements, he claimed that the strait has been permanently opened, not just for the U.S., but for China and the rest of the world, while also suggesting that talks with Iran could resume within days. Two completely different realities, one on paper, one on the water. Around 800 ships that had been waiting for weeks are cautiously beginning to move again, but shipping firms aren't celebrating. Insurance underwriters aren't dropping their premiums. The alternative pipelines that Saudi Arabia and the UAE scrambled to maximize, they are still running at full capacity, because nobody is rerouting back on the basis of an agreement that expires in 14 days. And here is what the markets are already quietly pricing in. This disruption lasted long enough for the world to realize it could adapt without the strait entirely. And in doing so, they may have accomplished something their adversaries spent years trying to achieve: accelerating the world's determination to build a future where the Strait of Hormuz simply does not matter anymore. The choke point that defined Middle Eastern power for half a century may have just engineered its own irrelevance.